in the beginning is now, never shall be, world without
ending.
Magandang gabi po.
Gandang gabi po.
sa inyo lahat.
Magsisimula na po tayo ng ating presentation. Ang pag-uusapan po natin ay yung East and West. Actually, yung dalawang bahagi ng story ng simbahan kung saan yung Eastern Empire ni Eastern portion ng Empire ni Constantine nahati, naglagay siya ng isang kapitolyo doon, yung Byzantium, which is actually yung Istanbul ngayon, sa Turkey. And ang second portion, yung West, the East and the West. Ang West naman ay nasa Roma, ang capital, dating capital. Pero since iniwan siya ni Constantine, kaya ang naging technically namuno ay ang simbahan. Yun po yung pinag-usapan natin last time. So, ang mag-present po ngayon sa atin ng East and West ay si Myra. Kung ready ka na, Myra, pag-ikuan na lang yan po. Pag-prepare na, please.
Sige po, saglit lang.
Dito po papasok yung problema ninyo sa Orthodoxy. Papasok yung Orthodoxy doon. So pag-uusapan po natin yun mamaya. Ano yung Orthodox Church na yun? Okay. Sige po, Myra.
Hello, good evening. Good evening po sa lahat.
Good evening po. Sige.
Good evening.
Thank you. So,
Good evening po.
magandang gabi po sa lahat. Ngayon, sa ating session sa Church History, ating pag-uusapan yung East and West. So, the Eastern Empire.
First among bishops for whom prayers were offered in the liturgy. Justinian. The emperors at Constantinople continued to call themselves emperors of Rome, and only gradually did the name Byzantine attach itself to their state. Justinian I, reigning 482 to 565, was the greatest of these emperors. Although he is of Balkan peasant origin, he was an educated man with an exalted sense of the authority of his office and can extend his empire in the West. Justinian set out to make Constantinople the most magnificent city in the world, especially in the rebuilding of the great church of Hagia Sophia. His reign's success was marked by a plague pandemic. The Persian threat. As the West increasingly fell under the control of the barbarians, the Eastern Empire remained relatively, albeit precariously, strong, mainly because of its sophisticated administrative structure and wealth. The Persians conquered much of the Near East early in the 7th century, devastating the Christians of Jerusalem, moving on to conquer Egypt, and besieging Constantinople itself. But Emperor Heraclius drove them off and in turn invaded Persia, recovering what was believed to be the true cross and personally carrying it on his shoulders back to Jerusalem. Court intrigues. Although powerful emperors sometimes fell victim to plots, Phocas in 602 to 610 seized the throne from Maurice during 582 to 602 and had Maurice and his 5 sons killed, only be killed himself 8 years later. Constantine VI, dated 780 to 797, was blinded and died at the instigation of his mother, while Irene was forced into a convent. State over Church. Justinian saw the Church as a branch of the state, a complex relationship. In the mid-5th century, the emperors were crowned by the Patriarch. But the emperors were responsible for preserving the integrity of the faith and often regulated church life by their decrees. They had the authority to summon councils, as Constantine had done at Nicaea. Only doctrinal issues were decided by the assembled bishops. Emperors bluntly rejected any claim that they were subject to the episcopal authority, but in practice, they controlled much of the episcopacy. Although bishops nominated other bishops and patriarchs, the emperor was not required to accept their nominees, which led to occasional flagrant abuses. Emperor Romanus, I dated 920-944, named his 16-year-old son, Theophylact, patriarch. Like emperors, patriarchs, and bishops were deposed with some frequency amidst the tangle of civil and religious factions. Monasticism. Religious orders never developed in the East as they did in the West. Each monastery was independent, although great houses exerted strong spiritual influence over lesser ones. The hermetical, cenobitic, and communal modes of life all flourished. From the 10th century onward, monastic life was found all over the East. The peninsula of Mount Athos, in Greece, was considered the spiritual powerhouse of the empire. As monks from a variety of places went there to establish monasteries of such rigor that not even female animals were allowed on the peninsula. Some monasteries resist imperial authority who upholds what was considered the full purity of Orthodox faith, although they were not immune from imperial censure. Some emperors resented the monasteries for attracting lavish donations that could have been used for other purposes. Emperors and popes. Although Justinian's code recognized the primacy of the See of Rome, the popes were treated as imperial administrators. The popes continued to be elected in Rome, but the emperors ratified their election. During the 6th and 7th centuries, most of the popes were Greeks and were not attracted to Rome as the capital of the Church or had come as refugees from imperial conflicts. The ecclesiastical authority was intertwined with secular politics. The empire continued to claim territory in Sicily and southern Italy, where there was a significant Eastern presence, including monasteries of Eastern monks. Appeals to Rome. In every Eastern quarrel, such as disputed elections of bishops, an appeal was likely to be made to the Pope, whose primacy of honor was universally acknowledged. During the 5th century, popes rebuked emperors twice for supporting heresy. They reminded them of the necessity of being in communion with the See of the Apostles in Rome. In the same Council of Chalcedon, that condemned monophysitism, they hailed Leo the Great. Also, they issued an ambiguous decree to make the See of Constantinople equal to Rome. Although the Pope's name continued to come first among bishops for whom prayers were offered in the liturgy, it remained ambiguous whether the East acknowledged Rome as the actual ruling authority. The growing estrangement, for example, Hadrian I in 772 to 795 was the first pope to omit reference to the reigning emperor in his proclamations. The Second Rome. The spiritual authority of Constantinople was precarious, unlike Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome. It was not an apostolic see but had been founded late and owed its prestige entirely to its being the capital of the empire. The church at Byzantium claimed that it had been founded by the apostle Saint Andrew, Peter's brother, and that Rome also derived its status primarily from having been the imperial capital, and that Constantinople was the new Rome. Patriarchates. Some Easterners proposed that the See of Antioch should have primacy since Peter had presided there before going to Rome. Alexandria traced its lineage to Saint Mark the Evangelist. In the 9th century, when the city was under Muslim control, Venetian adventurers took the apostle's body to Venice, where the magnificent Byzantine-style St. Mark's Basilica was built to house it. Complex relations. Theodoric, the Arian Ostrogothic king of Italy year 475 to 526, sent Pope St. John I to Constantinople to ask the Emperor Justin I to tolerate the Arians. Theodoric threw him into prison, where he died. Theodoric's successor Theodahad sent Pope Agapetus I year 535 to 536 to Constantinople to plead but not successful, against an imperial invasion of Italy. Both popes were treated with the greatest honors in the imperial capital, and Agapetus, who died there, was bold enough to depose a patriarch of Constantinople who deemed heretical and to consecrate a successor. But both popes also found themselves in a delicate position midway between the emperor who sought to reconquer Italy. Beginning in 556, the popes no longer sought confirmation of their elections from the emperors. The Photian Schism. In 858, Emperor Michael III, the drunkard, deposed Patriarch Ignatius of Constantinople year 877 and appointed the layman Photius dated 897 in his place, an act that Pope Nicholas I denounced. Photius soon claimed authority in southern Italy, and Nicholas excommunicated him, whereupon Photius accused the Western Church of heresy. Because of the doctrine of purgatory and the word filioque in the creed. Then a Byzantine council declared Nicholas deposed. However, after an imperial coup, the new emperor, Basil I, the Macedonian dated 867 to 886, sent Photius to a monastery and restored Ignatius. The Fourth Council of Constantinople years 869 to 870 affirmed the authority of the See of Rome, although the council was later repudiated in the East. The extent of papal authority remained uncertain in the East. In 903, Emperor Leo VI married his fourth wife and he was excommunicated by the Eastern bishops. He then obtained a dispensation from Rome, which the Eastern clergy refused to recognize. The orthodoxy of the Roman See. Part of Rome's prestige was its boast, which the East acknowledged, that it would never countenance heresy and that in the great early debates it had been the ultimate arbiter of orthodoxy, as Leo the Great had been during the Nestorian dispute. But Rome's orthodoxy was in some ways passive, in that there was a good deal less theological activity in the West. Easterners might condescend to Westerners as theologically backward, but Westerners could point out that the East was the hatching ground of almost all heresies. When an emperor patronizingly told a Western visitor that Westerners manifested a naive, childlike faith, the visitor admitted the claim but replied that the faith of the East was like an old worn-out garment. Monophysitism. Monophysitism survived in Egypt, Ethiopia, and Syria, especially among hyper-ascetic monks who in their zeal killed the patriarchs of Alexandria and Antioch at various times. Monophysitism was closely linked with the doctrine of deification, whereby, through grace, men can become progressively more like God, an idea largely unknown in the West, which would probably have resisted it because of the danger of Pelagianism. Though the Church in Egypt and Ethiopia quite early translated the Bible into the Coptic language, over time it went into schism. Theodora. Monophysitism was closely intertwined with the twists and turns of court politics, enjoying some imperial support. Justinian accepted the decrees of Chalcedon, but his wife, the famous Empress Theodora, d. 548, continued to support the Monophysites. The daughter of a lowly animal trainer and, according to some accounts, at one time a prostitute, Theodora was a woman of extraordinary ability. Pope Saint Agapetus I went to Constantinople to counteract Theodora's influence and to plead with Justinian not to invade Italy, but he died while in Constantinople. Justinian's armies retook Rome shortly thereafter, and Theodora was then able to secure the election of the anti-pope Vigilius, in rivalry to the newly elected Saint Silverius, whom the imperial agent in Italy deposed and sent into exile, where he died of starvation. The Church at Rome then accepted Vigilius as the rightful pope, but when he too resisted Theodora's agenda, he was taken by force to Constantinople, where he eventually signed an ambiguous formulary that was condemned in the West. After Theodora's death, the Second Council of Constantinople definitively reaffirmed the decrees of Chalcedon. Odium Theologicum. Theological disputes in the East extended even to the level of the common people and not infrequently erupted in violence. Fueled by obscure and illogical links that existed between theological opinions and loyalty to particular teams of professional charioteers. Early in his reign, Justinian was almost driven from Constantinople in the Nike riots, caused by Theodora's support of the Monophysites. He reportedly had 30,000 people put to death as punishment. Monothelitism. Patriarch Sergius of Constantinople year 638 proposes that Christ had only one will, a theory of monothelitism that sought to preserve his unity. Monothelitism was accepted by Pope Honorius I, but Pope Theodore deposed the monothelite Patriarch Paul of Constantinople. A judgment confirmed by Pope Saint Martin that resulted in bringing to Constantinople, where he was brutally treated, and sent into exile and died in Russia. In the Third Council of Constantinople year 680 by affirming that Christ had both a human and a divine will, that he experienced all human emotions except sinful ones, vindicated Martin and implicitly condemned Honorius, a condemnation made explicit by Pope Saint Agatho. Honorius' apparent espousal of monothelitism was the sole blot on Rome's record of orthodoxy, and Pope Leo II explained that Honorius had been merely negligent, not actively heretical. Maximus the Confessor. Saint Maximus the Confessor year 662 was the last of the great Greek fathers. He had been secretary to Emperor Heraclius. He became a monk and was savagely mutilated for his opposition to the monothelitism of Emperor Constans II Pagonidas. Maximus was also instrumental in the final condemnation of monophysitism, proposing that the mystical union of two natures in Christ affirmed the goodness of creation and the inherent dignity of human nature. Liturgy. The Eastern Church had three distinct liturgies, attributed to Saint James the Less, Saint Basil, and Saint John Chrysostom, respectively. Their differences from the West included the use of languages other than Greek, leavened bread, unwatered wine, and the epiclesis of the Holy Spirit to descend upon the communion elements in order to make Christ present. The Eucharist was not celebrated daily in the East. At a time when the administration of confirmation was gradually being separated from that of baptism in the West. Confirmation in the East was administered by chrismating or anointing the newly baptized baby, and the infant was then given communion. Even more than in the West, the experience of worship in the East was intended to offer a foretaste of heaven. The liturgy included long chants without instrumental accompaniment and was celebrated amidst almost unimaginable solemnity and splendor. The walls of Eastern churches were covered with mosaics or paintings of biblical scenes or of saints, hence the liturgy was celebrated in the presence of the saints. The iconostasis, a gated wall adorned with holy images, separated the altar from the body of the church, so that worshippers had only occasional glimpses of the sacred Eucharistic act. The dome. The use of the dome was distinctive to the East. Perhaps it derived from the Platonic idea of the circle as the perfect form, since it has no beginning and no end, hence it symbolizes eternity. In Byzantine churches, the worshippers saw heaven in the mosaics of the dome, looking up to the image of the Pantocrator. Icons. Icons or images were gradually Unlike the West, the East for the most part forbade the use of three-dimensional images, as constituting idols, the cross alone excepted. Two-dimensional pictures were permitted, and even exalted, not as mere representations of Christ and the saints but as a means by which holy persons were actually made present. Iconoclasm. The greatest crisis in the history of the Eastern Church was precisely over such images. Beginning in 730, Emperor Leo III, the Isaurian dated 717 to 741, condemned their use. The Church became bitterly divided over the issue. Pope Saint Gregory II upheld the use of icons, and Leo sent a fleet to arrest him. The iconoclasts or image breakers insisted that icons of Jesus separated his divine and human natures, since the divine nature was incapable of visualization, and that the veneration of icons thus amounted almost to polytheism as well as to idolatry. The true image of the saint was the replication of his virtues in the life of the believer. The iconoclasts insisted that the cross was the only legitimate image. Iconophilia. The condemnation of images amounted to a kind of Gnosticism and the attendant denial of the Incarnation itself and of the sacraments, both of which presuppose the belief that God could come to man through material means. There was much popular resistance to iconoclasm, with the monks, in particular, opposing the emperor on the issue. The iconophiles or image lovers or iconodule or image worshippers characterized the iconoclasts as Judaizers. still attached to the old law and defended an ancient practice that had deep theological meaning. It was thought possible to ascend the ladder of being to God through a series of steps, of which visible images were one stage. Paul's characterization of earthly knowledge of the divine as through a glass darkly, or the Platonic idea of images as archetypes. John of Damascus. Saint John of Damascus, or Damascene, year 749, the most important theologian of the age, was an iconophile who pointed out that the Jews in fact had images, notably the Ark of the Covenant, and that icons represented the history of Christ in the same way as the Gospels did. He formulated what became the standard teaching concerning the veneration of saints even in the West, distinguishing among different Greek terms: latreia, or worship for God alone; hyperdulia, or high honor for Mary; and dulia, or honor for the saints. The icons restored. Empress Irene, dated 780 to 803, restored the icons in 787 in the Second Council of Nicaea, reversing Emperor Leo III's ruling. But the controversy was by no means over, as the influence of the two parties seesawed back and forth. The issue remained alive until Empress Theodora II at last restored the icons permanently in 843. Holy men. The veneration of icons was the cult of wandering holy men, who were believed to have great spiritual power and who often attracted large popular followings. Both emperors and bishops looked on them with mistrust, as they embodied a charismatic authority at odds with hierarchy. In the 8th and 9th centuries, there was an organized campaign against them, during which some were put to death. The survival of dualism. The suspicion that iconoclasm was at heart Gnostic was given plausibility by the survival of various forms of heretical dualism in the empire, called by a variety of names, such as Bogomils and Polychians. These movements forced Christian apologists once more to affirm the goodness of all creation. Theological creativity. The East remained theologically creative even beyond the patristic age. But among the important differences between the East and West was the fact that the East did not develop a rigorous abstract theology like scholasticism. Pseudo-Dionysius. Pseudo-Dionysius, year 500, was perhaps Assyrian. His principal works were mystical theology, on the divine names, and on the celestial hierarchy, which reflected Neoplatonic philosophy. In their account, the soul's ascent to God by stages, culminating in a final leap in the dark, thereby making negative theology an integral part of Eastern thought. Maximus the Confessor expounded a distinctive Eastern theology of deification. God became man so that man can become God, ascending through the series of stages described by Pseudo-Dionysius. Man has free will that is prone to sin but is transformed by divine grace. The nature of sin. Augustine of Hippo had brought Western theology to a level equal to that of the East, but just as Augustine knew no Greek, the East was losing knowledge of Latin. Hence Maximus and other Eastern theologians were apparently unaware of Augustine's work. Augustine held that original sin was transmitted from parent to child through the very act of conception, whereas for Maximus, mankind shared in Adam's sin only in the sense of having a propensity for evil, not as something basic to human nature. Marian Devotion. Marian's devotion was especially strong in the East because Mary was the human being who had advanced farthest along the road toward deification. By the 8th century, she was being referred to as mediatrix of all graces, because salvation had come through her Son and therefore through her. In the West, the strong Augustinian doctrine of original sin strengthened the belief that Mary was conceived without sin, immaculate conception. Simeon the New Theologian. The most important Eastern theologian of the Middle Ages was Saint Simeon the New Theologian, who lived late in the 11th century. Simeon received it as an encomium. His approach was mystical, based primarily on the liturgy and the experience of monastic life, the lived faith as distinct from abstract speculation. Prayers for the dead. The Western belief in purgatory was based on the fact that many people died without having completed their penances. In the hope to a merciful God that allows them to discharge their obligation after death. But the Eastern Church did not necessarily impose such penances in confession and praying to the dead without explaining precisely why. Thus to the East, the doctrine of purgatory looked suspiciously like the heresy of Origen that the damned will eventually be released from hell. Adiaphora. Everyone acknowledged that there were adiaphora things that were indifferent in terms of doctrinal orthodoxy but were nonetheless points of difference between East and West, leavened or unleavened. Bread, the style of tonsures, a drop of water in the wine of the Eucharist. These were not easily resolved, because they were customs so deeply embedded in the entire way of life on both sides. Clerical marriage. Somewhat paradoxically, although the East was, on the whole, considered more rigorous and otherworldly than the West. As the West moved toward universal clerical celibacy, the Eastern Church still allowed clerical marriage, although bishops were drawn exclusively from the ranks of the celibate.
Ganun. Walang sound, lab.
Filioque. The disagreement over the filioque clause that the Holy Spirit proceeds from both the Father and the Son was the most substantive. The word had first been inserted into the creed under Charlemagne, perhaps to guard against subordinating the Son to the Father, but
Lab,
3,
bakit sila? Hindi ko pa rin naririnig yung sound.
declined to make it universal.
Meron pong sound, merong sound.
Some Easterners affirmed it, but overall the East viewed it as an improper innovation. Missionary efforts. Beginning with Justinian's uncle and predecessor Justin I, the Church at Constantinople sent missionaries to the parts of the Near East that remained pagan, Ethiopia and Arabia, the Black Sea region, and southeastern Europe. In the 2nd century, Armenia had a Christian king, Tradatus II, about whom little is known. Christians existed in the Persian Empire during the 4th century and were persecuted by adherents of the dominant religion, Zoroastrianism. Nestorianism survived there and in Syria, India, and even remote parts of China, which was missionized from Persia. The conversion of a whole people meant, among other things, that a particular society that had lain outside the boundaries of Christendom had now been incorporated into that spiritual whole, into civilization itself. Cyril and Methodius. The saintly brothers Constantine year 869 and Methodius year 885 in a sense founded Eastern European Christianity. They were men of importance in Constantinople and friends of Photius, but Methodius became a monk while his brother remained an imperial official. Although Rome and Constantinople were not as yet in schism from one another, there was rivalry in Eastern Europe over patriarchal oversight and the liturgy. Because they spoke the Slavic language, they were sent to the kingdom of Greater Moravia. They developed a written Slavic language and composed a vernacular liturgy in that language. whose liturgical use came to be called Old Church Slavonic. Constantine, they called Cyrillic. Methodius returned to Greater Moravia as its bishop, but for a time he was imprisoned by rival German bishops. After Methodius died, Pope Stephen VI forbade the Slavonic liturgy, and Germanic influence obliterated much of Methodius' work, which survived only farther to the east. The Magyar invasion of 906 to 907 destroyed much of Moravian Christianity. The Kievan Rus. Vladimir of Kiev sent emissaries to the leading centers of Christianity, including Rome, but affiliated his principality with the Patriarchate of Constantinople because his ambassadors described the heavenly liturgy as celebrated there. Boris of Bulgaria similarly vacillated between Rome and Constantinople, finally choosing the latter. Russian and Bulgarian churches were then built in the Byzantine style, even as Poland's orientation toward Rome was manifest in its Romanesque and Gothic churches. The Great Schism. Michael Cyrillarius, year 1059, a patriarch of Constantinople, showed such independence that he clashed even with the emperor. He opposed Western religious practices, the filioque, priestly celibacy, unleavened bread and communion so aggressively that he closed the Latin churches in his see city. Partly in response, Pope Leo IX in 1054 sent a delegation to Constantinople under Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida. Humbert de Moyen Mudir, year 106. The delegates received a friendly welcome from Emperor Constantine IX. 1042 to 1055, but Cyrillarius' intransigence was matched by Humbert, who pronounced an excommunication on the Patriarch and placed the decree on the altar of Hagia Sophia. Although this incident has traditionally been treated as marking the final split between Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, it was not seen as such at the time. Among other things, the force of Humbert's decree was doubtful, because Leo IX died during the episode. Muhammad. Islam, meaning submission, began in the Arabian Peninsula with a wealthy merchant named Muhammad in the year 632, who probably lived with Jews. Muhammad claimed to be a prophet who had received from the angel Gabriel the revelation that there is only one God, Allah, and that all should completely submit to Allah by following Muhammad. In the face of fierce opposition, he left his native city of Mecca for Medina, from which he mounted a triumphant military return Mecca. Quran. The new religion did not develop a complex theology, in the way Christianity did. Its sacred text, the Quran, is a collection of the sayings of Muhammad, who claimed his statements were revealed by God through the angel Gabriel. The Quran was compiled after Muhammad's death and deals primarily with matters of behavior, laws concerning worship, ascetical practices, and personal conduct. No religion in history came to dominate so much territory in so brief a time. In the period from 638 to 643, three of the four Eastern Patriarchates, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria, fell to those whom the Byzantines called Arabian wolves. Persia was conquered in 652, and all of North Africa by 707. But Muslim conquest was restrained somewhat by a bitter and permanent split that occurred shortly after Muhammad's death, between Shiites, who held that the movement had to be led by a blood relative of the Prophet, and Sunnites, who elected their own caliphs. Schism. As Islam splintered, its principal capitals became Baghdad in Mesopotamia, Damascus in Syria, and Córdoba in Spain. The crescent became its symbol, and, coincidentally, the Islamic empires roughly came to describe a crescent on the map, stretching from Mesopotamia in the east, across North Africa, and curving northward to the Pyrenees. A rising threat. Its conquests were principally at the expense of the Byzantine Empire. The Muslims reached Constantinople itself in the years 674 to 678 and again in 717 to 718 and were repulsed only with difficulty. There were occasional imperial victories, as when Monophysite Armenia was freed from Muslim rule in the 920s, and the victors found what was believed to be a burial cloth of Jesus. Radical monotheism. Islam was a religion of radical monotheism, implacably hostile to anything that appeared to compromise that truth. While Christians were in disagreement for centuries over the use of force in spreading their faith, Muhammad had no such doubts, so the new faith used the sword wherever it encountered resistance. People of the Book. Partial tolerance was allowed for the people of the book, the Bible. Because both the Old and New Testaments were viewed by Muslims as divinely inspired, and some biblical figures like Abraham to Jesus that they considered great prophets. The error of Christianity, according to Muhammad, was divinizing of Jesus, a heresy that he claimed to be empowered to correct. Like some Jews, Muslims regarded Christians as polytheists. Because of the doctrine of the Trinity, Muslim policy varied from time to time and place to place. The restricted theoretical toleration of Christians and Jews was often violated, and Christians are subjected to harassment or persecution. But Christians also sometimes served as bureaucrats or soldiers of Muslim rulers. Example: John Damascene was an official of the Caliphate of Damascus. Converts. In imperial territories conquered by Islam, such as Syria, equal tolerance was extended to both Orthodox Christians and Monophysites, and other heretics. Few Muslims seem to have converted to Christianity under the empire, but a good number of Christians made the reverse journey. Because as heretics they did not enjoy the patronage of the Byzantine emperor, many Nestorians, and Monophysites, in particular, became Muslims. Enslavement. Christians who were captured either in battle or by Muslim raiding parties that got as far north as England were often enslaved. And the religious order of the Mercedarians was founded especially to ransom them. Blessed Sirapion year 1240 was a soldier in the Spanish Wars who became a member of the order, went to Algiers to free captives, and was crucified for preaching Christianity. The Holy Land. Muslims controlled the Holy Land beginning in the 7th century, and Christians were allowed to visit the holy places but not to build shrines. Although in 1009 a sultan who was possibly insane had the Church of the Holy Sepulchre destroyed. An attempt was made in 1033 to organize a major pilgrimage to the Holy Land since Christ had not returned 1,000 years after his death. But would-be pilgrims soon found that the obstacles to such a project were formidable indeed. The emperors sometimes sponsored formal disputations between Christian and Muslim or Jewish scholars, primarily to convert the non-Christians but also having the effect of familiarizing Christians with Muslim and Jewish doctrines. In the West, Peter the Venerable arranged to have the Quran translated into Latin, to be able to refute it, and Aquinas' Summa contra Gentiles was in part aimed at converting Muslims. The First Crusade. The timing of the First Crusade in 1095 was fortuitous, in that the Muslims themselves were divided at the time. The leading Western European monarchs all happened to be excommunicated in 1095, and Urban II appointed a French bishop as the Crusade's official leader. While military leadership devolved on high-ranking members of the nobility. As many as 150,000 Christians answered the call, but the difficulties were enormous, and only about 40,000 finally arrived. Several crusading armies traveled by different routes and met at Constantinople, where they took oaths of fealty to the emperor, whose armies also participated in the war. The Franks. The Byzantines viewed the Franks with misgivings or worse. The chronicler Anna Comna, daughter of Emperor Alexius Comnenus 1081–1118, sees them as repulsive barbarians. The Crusaders often ignored their oaths to the emperor, and over the next 2 centuries, the emperors were not above negotiating secretly with the Muslims against the Crusaders. Nobility and brutality. The contradictions inherent in the crusading phenomenon were manifest from the beginning, as fierce warriors, enlisted in a noble cause. Nonetheless sometimes terrorized both Christians before even catching sight of a Muslim and sometimes massacred Muslim towns that fell into their hands. The Muslims were equally brutal and had been so long before the Crusaders arrived. The Latin kingdoms. The First Crusade made steady progress. Jerusalem fell in 1099, and a kingdom was set up under French noblemen. First Godfrey of Bouillon 1100, then his brother Baldwin dated 1118. Muslims were at first treated tolerantly. The Western rulers attempted as far as possible to replicate the institutions they knew at home, particularly the feudal system, building Western-style castles to maintain security. As always with feudalism, there was constant intrigue and rivalry among the ruling houses and the military orders, not infrequently including minor wars. The Church. There was a great influx of Westerners into the Near East, and several Latin churches were established, but Eastern Christians retained their liturgies. The Patriarchates of Jerusalem and Antioch were brought under papal authority, and Western bishops were appointed usually by the King of Jerusalem, confirmed by the Pope to replace the Eastern prelates. Pope Paschal II demanded that the Eastern churches recognize the Roman primacy, but a formal East-West dialogue 2 decades later failed to resolve the issue. Knights Templar. In 1118, the Knights Templar was founded in Jerusalem on the site of Solomon's original temple as a community of lay warriors. They eventually came to observe a monastic rule written for them by Bernard of Clairvaux, which included life in community, vows, and the divine office. The Templars may have possessed the Shroud of Turin, an ancient cloth that bears the image of a crucified man and is believed by many people to be the burial cloth of Jesus. The shroud was probably taken from Constantinople in 1204 and was held by the Templars for the next century, first placed on public display in France in 1357. Knights of St. John. The Knights of St. John of Jerusalem were founded around the same time as the Templars, to care for the sick and wounded. They operated 2,000-bed hospitals in Jerusalem, but they also evolved into a military order, known first as the Knights of Rhodes and later as the Knights of Malta. The Knights of Malta still exist as a fraternal order that cares for the sick, but the group long ago gave up its military character. Prester John. In 1122, Western Christians were given another motive for undertaking expeditions to the east. when a mysterious individual appeared in Rome claiming to be a powerful Christian king of a great unknown kingdom in the East. Later in the century, Pope Alexander III received a letter purportedly from the same ruler, and the quest for the illusory Prester John became an occasional minor obsession for the next 4 centuries. The Second Crusade. The Christian states in the Near East struggled to survive during the first half of the 12th century, and in 1145, the Second Crusade was preached by Bernard. Louis VII of France became the first Western monarch to take the cross, followed by German Emperor Conrad III. The crusade gained little, and Christians in the Near East remained divided by suspicions and conflicting ambitions. The cities of the Holy Land fell to the Muslims one by one, often accompanied by the slaughter of their inhabitants, and in 1187, the great Muslim ruler Saladin 1193 retook Jerusalem, allowing the Christians limited toleration. The Third Crusade. The Third Crusade followed, the largest military effort of the entire Middle Ages, financed by a Saladin tithe to be collected throughout Christendom. It seemed to fulfill the original papal dream of a united Christendom. Although the Byzantine Emperor Isaac II Angelus did not welcome the Crusaders and secretly negotiated with the Muslims, Frederick Barbarossa, Philip II Augustus of France, and Henry II of England agreed to lead the attack. But Henry died before he could set out and was replaced by his son Richard I the Lion-Hearted. Barbarossa died in the Holy Land in a freak accident, falling from his horse in full armor and drowning in a shallow stream. The 2 remaining leaders, Philip and Richard, quarreled, and the campaign that began with great expectations unraveled. The 2 crusades failed to retake Jerusalem but did save other Christian holdings. The Fourth Crusade. Notoriously, the Fourth Crusade was subverted by intrigues among the Crusaders themselves, mainly the Normans, who were the first warriors to arrive and who placed one of their own on the imperial throne, the Venetians, who provided transportation to the Near East, and the Byzantines. The Crusaders were first diverted to conquer a city in the Balkans that had rebelled against Venetian dominance. Then the exiled Byzantine Emperor Alexius IV Angelus asked for their help. The Crusaders took Constantinople, which was then perhaps the largest and richest city in the world, and partly perhaps in retaliation for a massacre of Latin Christians some years before brutally sacked it, desecrating churches and contemptuously placing a prostitute on the throne of the Patriarch in Hagia Sophia. Shared churches. Until well into the 14th century, Venice kept control of the islands of Crete and Cyprus in the eastern Mediterranean, where they allowed the Eastern Christians to retain their observances. In some cases, Easterners and Westerners shared the same churches, each celebrating their liturgy. The Fifth Crusade. The Fifth Crusade was proclaimed by Innocent III in 1213, but it did not begin for 4 years and like its predecessors had little effect. The Crusaders had concluded that it was strategically necessary to conquer Egypt to reconquer the Holy Land, but they failed in that goal. The most notable aspect of the Fifth Crusade was the presence of Francis of Assisi, who met with Sultan Al-Kamil and boldly attempted to convert him to Christianity. Frederick II, Emperor Frederick II was among those taking the cross, but he was excommunicated after several delays in setting out for the Holy Land. He then married the daughter of King John I of Jerusalem and on that basis claimed the kingdom for himself. In 1229, he obtained Jerusalem through negotiations with a weakened Al-Kamil, but most Christians regarded this as a betrayal because they held the city only at the Sultan's pleasure. And Frederick promised that there was to be no crusade for at least 10 years. Frederick soon returned to Germany, and in 1244, Jerusalem fell to the Muslims for the final time.
Later efforts. Periodically thereafter, various Christian princes arrived in the Holy Land with no lasting result. The last Christian outposts, Tyre, Beirut, Haifa, and the biblical cities of Tyre and Sidon, fell in 1291. Their survivor ruthlessly persecuted. Limited pilgrimage. Franciscan made converts from Islam during the ascendancy of the Latin kingdoms in the Near East. After the fall of those Christian outposts, they enjoyed the precarious tolerance in Holy Land. They were permitted to care for the Christian shrine. Mughals Catholic conversion. The Mughals or Mongols were yet another wave of barbarian to invade Europe. They established an empire that stretched from China to Eastern Europe. Catholic conversion. Because of Norman incursion in Byzantine Sicily, Emperor Michael VIII Pelagius from the year 1259 to 1282 sought Western allies, and in 1274 an Eastern delegation attended the Second Council of Lyons, when both Emperor Pelagius and Patriarch John Veccus submitted to papal authority. The Council of Florence and Ferrara. Ferrara nor Florence was much opportunity for a sophisticated exchange between East and West over the perennial issues that separated them. Reunion proclaimed. The urgent hope for the Crusades to turn back to the Turks was the principal driving force from Byzantine ecumenism. There was some genuine desire for reunion, and in 1452, reunion was actually proclaimed in Hagia Sophia. The fall of Constantine. Final fall of the empire to the Turks in 1453 brought an end to most Latin influence in Near East. The Ottoman threat. Leo X pressed hard to get the European monarch to respond to the alarming expansion of the power of Ottoman. But over the next century, a successive pope tried vainly to mount new crusades. The Ottoman advanced further into Eastern Europe. Lepanto. The Knights of Malta on their tiny Mediterranean island withstood the Turkish advance, and in 1571, the Spanish commander Don John of Austria, illegitimate son of Charles V and half-brother of Philip II of Spain, won a great naval victory over the Turks at Lepanto, off the coast of Greece, as Pope St. Pius V urged the Catholics to pray the Rosary for the cause of victory, and so Turkish ships were devastated by high winds. Battle in Vienna. Later in 17th century, the Catholic Louis XIV of France encouraged the Turks to attack his archrival, Catholic Austria, but they reached the gates on Vienna in 1683. The Unites. The Unites, after the Catholic Orthodoxy split of the Middle Ages, the Holy See showed an increasing willingness to make an accommodation with those Eastern Christian, some called Unites, who were in common with the Rome. Liturgy. The liturgy in both rite themselves and the language in which they are celebrated primarily defines these various. Monasticism. Monasticism is integral in the Eastern churches. Their monk, often called Basilian, distinct from the Latin rites order of the same name because they follow the monastic rule of Saint Basil the Great. Celibacy. The Unites follow the Eastern custom of allowing the priest to marry prior to the ordination because choosing only celibates, often monks, as bishop. Patriarchs. Each of the Eastern churches is headed by a prelate, some whom bear an ancient title of patriarchs, who appoint bishop, who in turn elect the patriarchs, but subject to the confirmation of the Holy See. The Eastern rites. The history of the most Eastern rite is extremely complex, mainly because of the exchanging politics and the political condition that strongly influence religious loyalties. Byzantine. The Byzantine Rite, which is the largest, uses Old Church of Slavonic. The language is originally introduced into the liturgy by Cyril and Methodius. Ruthenian. The Ruthenians, who were closely related to Russia ethnically, are the branch of Byzantine rites found mainly in the Ukraine, Poland, Slovakia, Serbia, and Hungary. Andre Bobola. Bitter strife between Orthodox and Unites continued for another century after the reunion in 1595. Saint Andrew Bobola was a Polish Jesuit of a noble birth who worked in the Lithuania to convert the Orthodox. Andreas Skepsky. Saint Andreas Septisky, Metropolitan of was put under the house arrest by the Polish government. But over the next generation, due to mainly the leadership, the Lithuanian church was recovered. Joseph Sleepy. Sepstisky, successor of Joseph Sleepy, was also imprisoned by Soviet for many years, and after World War II, the Soviet government again decreed the reunion of the Ruthenian with Orthodoxy. Other rites. In predominant Orthodox Transylvanian, part of today's Romania, the Byzantine Rite was recognized by the Holy See in 1697, after Jesuits had reconciled some of the Orthodox to Catholic Church. Near East. Anomalously, until 1992, the French government, no matter how anti-clerical, was the official protractor of the Near Eastern Catholics. The Melkites. The Melkites came to be completely under the authority of Constantinople in the time adopted by Byzantine rites and were part of the schism in 1054. Moronites. The Moronites derived from their name Assyrian monastery that strongly opposed the Monophysites after the Chaldean. Armenia. The Church Armenia is also embraced by monophysitism in the early centuries. Although there were fragile reunion with Rome during the Crusades and a nominal acceptance of the Decree of Florence. Chaldeans, the Church Persia and Mesopotamia, modern Iran and Iraq. The Copts. The majority of the Egyptian Christian were also refused to accept the decree of Chalcedon and became a separate Coptic or Egyptian church that retained the monophysites' belief. Ethiopia. Despite missionary effort over the centuries, remained firmly monophysites. In 17th century reconciled with Rome for complex political reasons. St. Thomas Christians. During the Middle Ages, the Holy See periodically sent legates to Christians in India who traced their spiritual ancestry to St. Thomas the Apostles and who recognized the authority of Pope about whom they knew very little. Syro-Malabar Rites. The Syro-Malabar Rites is the largest Eastern church after Ukrainians. The three of the 10th largest order of women in the church, the Franciscan Clarist Congregation, the Congregation of the Mother of God of Carmel, and the Sister of the Adoration of the Blessed Sacraments are part of it. So, this will end our report for the East and West. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much, Sister Myra. So, it's 9:13. I'm going to give you 30 minutes. Discuss it among yourselves in the breakout room. And then, pagbalik natin sa main call, pwede natin pag-usapan yung mga tanong ninyo. So, sa loob ng 1:40 at 9:45, babalik po tayo dito sa main call. Ano pa? Dali lang. Ilan tayo lahat? We are 33. Tayo lang. Pasok na po kayo doon sa classroom or sa breakout room. Myra, paki-close na yung presentation mo. Join na po kayo doon sa classroom, sa breakout room. Brother Danny, Sister Lita, Malu, Brother Louis, Sister Beng, Sister Tess. Join na po kayo sa, sa breakout room. Just click the join. Okay. Sister Tess, Brother Louis, Sister Malu, Brother Danny. All right.
Naging ganyan din pala yung ika. Naging ganyan din pala yung ika, no?
Okay. Nagtag ng dalawang ano? Hindi pa nag-ano ko, breakout room.
Ilan po?
244. Pababa na, naka-flat na. Naka-flat na nga.
It's a
Alright. Nandito na po tayo sa main call. Okay, napag-usapan nyo na po yung meeting natin kung ano yung critical sa inyo. Ano pong, meron po ba kayong gustong i-clarify? Nandiyan si Sister Myra. Yes. Meron pa?
Brother
Apa?
Steve, pwedeng kasi yun nga sabi ni Sister Myra, tatlo yung difference ng Eastern Church sa Western Church. Yung una, yung bread nila ay leavened, sa atin ay unleavened.
Epa.
Pangalawa, yung alak nila ay puro.
Hmm.
Kaya madaling malasing ang pare. Sa atin halo ng tubig. Yung pangatlo, yung filioque. Pwedeng alam ko na-discuss niyo ito, pero medyo pwedeng paki-discuss ulit.
Okay. Hindi lang yung tatlong yun ang pagkakaiba ng Eastern or yung Orthodox or yung Eastern churches. Meron pa yan yung general judgment, iba yung general judgment sa kanila at saka yung particular judgment. And then another one is yung
Purgatory.
purgatory, iba yung kanilang konsepto ng purgatory. Alright, so dun sa issue na yon tungkol sa filioque, ang problema ng developmental theology nila, pag-develop ng theology nila, nakabase yan doon sa tawag dito, Nicene Chalcedonian Creed, no? Yung ginawa ng Nicene Chalcedonian Creed. Nakalagay kasi doon is yung proceeding from the Father lang. Wala yung and the Son, the filioque. Ang ibig sabihin ng filioque kasi is yung and the Son. Wala sa Eastern Church yung in the Son. Kasi they're trying to go back, sinasabi nga nila, go back to the Chalcedonian, Nicene Chalcedonian Creed. Kaso ang problema dyan is yung perception nila dun sa ang translation nila ng Chalcedonian Creed is through the Son, dia. Ano ba yung pan? Yung Son, through the Son, dia, through the Son. At sa atin naman kasi and the Son. So walang pagkakaiba yun doon sa Greek text mismo. Ang pinakakuan ang pinaka-essence nung dia huyos, no? Dia huyos through the Son at saka yung kai huyos, pareho lang yun sa Greek. So hindi talaga nagkakaroon ng problema yon. Merong merong discussion yun kung gusto niyo talaga ng detalya para makita ninyo yung pagkakaiba noon. Yung tinatawag na filioque controversy. Ang kwan actually parang political issue lang yan. Sabi nga natin doon sa presentation kanina, si Cerilarius ay actually masyado siyang independent in such a way that he does not want to recognize Rome as the head. Ayaw niya ang kunin yung primacy of Peter. Ayaw niya noon. So political lang naging orientation. So the moment na nagkaroon siya ng possibility na may pakita yung kanyang pagsuway, ginawa niya yung excommunication. Yun namang pinadala ni Papa na legate doon, strong-willed din ng todo yun. Kaya nga both excommunication ang ginawa. So the East excommunicated the West and the West excommunicated the East. Kaso mayroon ng doubt as to whether that was efficacious dahil namatay yung Papa bago na ikuan yun. Bago na i-ratify basically. Kaya lang, yun ang sinundan nung East eh. Although there was a brief reconciliation doon sa 1500 nga, pero hindi nagkaroon ng kwan yun dahil naging headstrong na yung East, the Greek Church at saka yung Russian Church kasi doon nagkaroon ng development yung tinatawag nilang Third Rome. Ang gusto kasi nilang kwan is yung imperial, no? Kaya sa atin, ang First Rome is Rome, no? Yun ang capital of the empire before. No, magkaroon ng Byzantine group, yung Second Rome, sasabi nila, sila na yung prevailing Second Rome, wala na yung First Rome. that is Istanbul na, Constantinople. Nung magkaroon naman ng deterioration ng Constantinople, nagkaroon naman ng development yung Russia. Kaya naman yung Russia declared that they're the third Rome. So sila ngayon ang sinasabi ng mas mapayagpag, basically. Yun lang, political yun, basically. Yung yung sunod, yung tinatawag na tawag dito, epeklesis, particularly yung epeklesis, sa kanila kasi, ang spirito nga proceeds from the Father and the Son. So kinakailangan parang mag-pray na dumating yung Espiritu Santo doon sa offering. Dahil hindi sila naniniwala sa filioque, so kinakailangan ang Espiritu ay bumaba para magkaroon ng efficacy yung consecration. Yung, ano pa yung isa? Ano yung Brother Jess? Filioque, saka yung
purgatory, sinabi
kasi
sabi ng purgatory.
iba yung kanilang konsepto ng purgatory. A little differential. Pagkatapos, ano pa yung isa, yung tatlo?
Yung
bread.
leaven, the bread.
Leaven bread. Kasi kung naman sila doon, that is just, actually, yung kinain ni Cristo is unleavened. Kasi nga yung matcha, the matcha is unleavened. Pero alam mo naman yung mga fan, anong available na bread, kinakailangan. Kaya wala namang problema yun sa leaven sa unleavened. The only difference there, masyadong maraming mumu yun. Siyempre, basta leavened bread yun, kakalat ng kakalat. And because of that, ginawa yung, or rather naging sa Roman Church, yung unleavened, para hindi masyadong makalat, basically. Pero ang kwan na yun, loaf talaga yung sa Russia. And then, sa Russia at saka sa Orthodox Church, meron silang particular na pang-cut ng bread na yun. Isang lance, parang ano yun, parang spear, something. They have to spear the bread para makain. Pagtusok ni Longinos, di ba? Basically, nire-reenact yun doon sa liturgy. So may tusok doon sa bread. Kaya ang ginagamit nila yung lance na yun eh. Yun lang nga, makakaya. Pero, yeah.
Nag-message po si Sister Cynthia Manalo. Yung pag-sign of the cross daw, iba rin daw.
Yes. Wala namang problema yun. Kasi ang walang dyan is, nadidiscuss natin yan before, no? Tatlong kwan kasi yun, tatlong forma, pero pare-pareho ang meaning. Sa atin kasi, sa Roman Church, pwedeng yung kwan, tatlo dito, ganyan, saka yung dalawa dito. Or lima, yung 5 wounds, no? In the name of the Father, the Son, the Spirit. Yung 5 wounds yun eh. Pero pag ang ginamit mo yung tatlong ganyan at saka yung dalawa dito, ito yung Trinitarian formulation. Ito yung dual nature ni Cristo. Kaya sa atin, kung ganito ang ginagamit mong pag-antanda, pwede yon. Ganon din yan sa, pwede ring ganyan. Kung minsan, ito ang ginagamit ito pang antanda eh. Ito naman, Trinitarian ito yung dual nature ni Cristo. Yun ang ginagamit. Now, ang pagkakaiba lang sa atin, ang cross natin ay mula sa kaliwa papuntang kanan. Father, Son, and Spirit, no? Sa kanila, ang one is they have to make the sign of the cross and bow at the same time. So kaya mga Greeks, pag nako siya, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and the diretso bow yun. Kaya actually, they are actually bowing on the cross that they have traced on themselves. Isa yun sa kwan, isa yun sa methodology. Okay po? Ano pa? Meron pa problema?
Tanong ko.
Yes.
About yung
brother.
pagkain.
Salamat po.
Brother John.
Oh.
Ulit. Lakas-lakasan mo, please.
May tanong lang ako sa unleavened bread na tinutusok using a lance.
Yes. Yes.
Ano
Yes.
ano pong basihan nila kasi sa Last Supper walang ganon.
Hindi, inakasin nila yung crucifixion. As far as they're concerned, kinakailangan talagang meron ng panghati. Hindi kasi pwedeng buwanan ng break lang talaga eh. Liturgical 'yon, hindi yan exegetical ha. So ang kanya is they are reenacting the crucifixion doon sa liturgy sa pamamagitan ng pag-break of the bread. Yung pinagkakuha natin yung breaking of the bread, the fractio, pag hinati mo yung bread, yun. Instead of us doing the fractio only, kinakailangan gumamit sila ng particular na lance na yun. So
parang inimagine nila ang suffering ni Christ
Hindi naman, it's just a fraction. Sa atin kasi, hinahati yung bread. To symbolize, ang pinaka-symbol ng hati is death talaga yun ni Kristo na matay. Kaya merong fraction, Pero sa kanila, talagang tinusok para mamatay. Ibig sabihin, yung fraction nila is yung pagtusok nung particular lunch na yun na ginagamit sa liturgy.
Ito yung piercing of the flesh to master, di ba?
Yep.
The piercing of the flesh ni Longhino, the centurion who so this is the reenactment bale ng piercing of the flesh bale.
Yeah. Ang pala dyan is that is our fraction. Sa Latin man, yung fraction, yung paghati ng bread. So sa kanila, they have to use that as the fraction. Kasi ang symbolism kasi ng fraction is namatay. So the same is true with the piercing of the bread.
So more of a ritual bale.
Liturgy nga. Liturgical pa niya.
Liturgical ritual.
Liturgical yan. Okay? Meron pa po?
Kami po. Doon po
Yes.
sa grupo namin, nais po namin itanong na kung dito po daw ba sa Pilipinas ay may ginagawa pa rin Easter rice?
May Eastern Rite tayo sa Philippines. Doon sa may bandang North EDSA ng North EDSA sa tawag dito sa Shumart, sa may bandang kaliwa, papuntang Caloocan, sa may bandang kaliwa, may makikita kayo isang malaking simbahan dyan. Although ngayon, may makikita na kayong statwa. Pero before, wala yung statwang yon. Ang nandoon is yung isang branch ng Orthodox. I don't know kung Byzantine ang ginagamit na. Pero that is the presence here. Merong ibang Byzantine liturgy rin dito, pero maliit lang naman kasi sila. Before, dyan sa may bandang PUP, yung pababa doon sa school mismo, sa may bandang kanan, merong Orthodox Church. Pero wala na ngayon, hindi ko na makita. Alright?
Salamat po.
Okay.
Brother Risti.
Yes.
May connect ko lang kasi sa may mga defenders kasi sa Visayas, medyo naging issue ngayon yung death of Christ. Namatay daw is human life only, not his divine life.
Gnostic yun, ha? Huwag niyo kunin yun because that is not an issue. That is a condemned heresy. Heretic yun pag nagsabi na ang namatay lang si Kristo yung tao. Hindi yun ang kwan eh. Ang kwan yung persona ang namatay. Okay? Pero yung naturalesa niya, syempre ang mamamatay yung naturalesang human. Pero hindi pwedeng sabihin na yung persona mismo hindi namatay. Okay? He gave up the spirit. Di ba sa crucifixion and sa John, he gave up the spirit. Sa John, yun yung pinaka-descent of the spirit. Kung kay Lucas ang descent of the spirit sa Cenaculo, kay John ang descent of the spirit yung he gave up the spirit. And yung gave up the spirit na yun, hindi pa akyat, kundi pa baba. Kaya binigay ang spirito ni Kristo doon sa crucifixion. Alright?
Okay po.
Heretical yun, wag niyong panin. That's Docetism eh. Ang panila doon is the Docetist understanding. Ang namatay lang ay yung katawan. At yung si Kristo ay tumatawa. Sa mga Docetist, pinapakita doon sa tinatawanan ng Kristo yung namatay nandun sa cross. Sabi nila, hindi nila alam kung anong nangyayari. That is the Docetist stance. Hindi po ako niya, hindi nga dyan sa Katoliko.
Okay po. Thank you.
Meron pa po. Wow, alas 10 na. Meron pa pong tanong bago tayo mag-close.
Request lang po.
Yes po.
Baka pwede daw po maibahagi sa amin yung PowerPoint.
Sure,
Kasi
si
para kasi po sa aming mga nag-uumpisa ay talagang maganda pong balik-balikan yung presentation. Maganda po kasi.
meron, nakakuha naman yan, naka-record naman yan. Ipapasok lang sa, i-download nyo na lang mula doon sa, Monica, kailan mo ma-upload?
This week po, sir. Edit
Okay.
lang po ng konti, then upload po.
Pag na-edit na yung record ngayon, i-upload doon sa classroom. I-download nyo na lang po.
Salamat
Yung
po.
mga humingi ng agreement o parang humingi ng diretso po yun. Pag pumunta kayo sa classroom, pwede nyo i-download yun. Hindi naman kinakailangan i-share pa yun eh. Nakashare na yun. Okay pa?
Thank you po.
Okay. Meron pa po? Wala na. Okay. Tayo po ay mako-closing na.